Again, thank you for taking the time to attend the webinar. Today I'm going to talk about a frequent challenge for language professionals using Excel to create glossaries. Now, most of my examples are in English, with a few examples also from different languages. Please excuse me if I've made any mistake because I am not multilingual. But regardless of the language we use in these examples, the same principles apply no matter what language you're using. Okay. So, let's see now, okay, there we are. Getting value out of your Excel glossaries. So, okay, getting started now. And anyone who knows me, and some of you do, knows that Excel is not my favorite tool. I much prefer using proper format for glossaries and terminology, such as term-based exchange, which is the XML format for terminology markup from the International Standards Organization. But nevertheless, spreadsheets are widely used. They aren't specifically designed for managing terminology, and they certainly have a lot of shortcomings, but they are widely used because they are accessible on most computers, and almost everybody knows how to use spreadsheets. So it's very convenient for using them. Excel is just a tool that everybody's familiar with, so we see them used a lot for glossaries. Now the problem is that there's no standard format for glossaries in Excel, and as a result, virtually every glossary in Excel looks a little bit different. The columns can have different headings, and they can be in different order. This makes it difficult to use the glossaries in certain situations, such as to import the terminology into a computer-assisted translation tool. And when you send a glossary to translators, they have to get familiar with your own format, which might be different than what they have seen before. Excel also handles synonyms quite poorly, and I'll show you examples of this in a moment. But the most serious problem I see is when people ignore the principle of data granularity. That is, when they put a bunch of different stuff into the same column. And we'll also see examples of this in a moment. So if we follow certain best practices, we can still use Excel quite efficiently and save a lot of avoid a lot of problems. So my goal today is to give you some tips how to make your glossaries most effective and to save you some time, mostly by doing things right in the first place. So often I've been given a glossary that took someone else significant time to prepare, and then I have to spend hours fixing problems before it can be used for other purposes. So this is what we want to avoid, the rework involved in manipulating Excel sheets. We want to make sure that translators can use the glossary effectively, that the glossary could eventually be imported into a database, just in case you might have one day. Even if you don't use a database today, you might want to in the future. And that the terms are optimized for use in other applications such as computer-assisted translation tools and for controlled authoring software. For this to work, the format of the terms has to align somewhat with the matching functions, the matching algorithms in these tools. You know, for example, if you use STL Trados, they have this function called the auto lookup function. And if your the terms in your glossary get imported into a multi-term database and they're not aligned somewhat to the way the auto lookup function works in STL Trados, then you're going to have a problem. So let's get to the tips. Okay. The most common use case for using spreadsheets for glossaries is for creating a bilingual or a multilingual reference for translators, whether or not they use a CAT tool, okay, the computer-assisted translation tool. This presentation focuses on this particular use case then, the use for translators. So the first question is, what terms do you need to include in the spreadsheet? Well, you can and you should include just about anything that can drive quality, consistency, and productivity in the translation process. So this is where I challenge the notion of what a term is in the localization and translation process. It doesn't, what you need to put into a glossary or a term database to help translators is not always a term in the technical sense or scientific sense. It can be a lot of other things. It can be words from the general lexicon that have multiple possible translations or have multiple possible meanings. It could be something that's on the user interface or on packaging material. It's not really technical in meaning, but nevertheless you have a concern about using and translating it consistently. So anything important or anything that that translators might need to think about is a candidate for inclusion in a spreadsheet glossary. Okay. Now, once you've decided what to include in your glossary, you need to make sure that you put the terms in this so-called normal form, which is called canonical form by linguists. So, nouns should be singular, they should be in lowercase, the verb should be infinitive, and so forth. If a noun is always used in the plural, and some nouns are, then the plural form is the canonical form. And the canonical form of proper nouns, these names, are usually, of course, initial capitals. That's okay, put them in initial capitals. Again, the motivation for this rule is to increase the alignment of your glossary terms to the matching functions in the computer-assisted translation or other tools that you might use, even if not now, possibly in the future. So here we see some example of the wrong form and the right form for 3 different terms. Okay. Nevertheless, if there are alternate forms of a term that are in use in your organization, even if their use is discouraged in favor of a preferred form, include them also in your glossary. For instance, here we have 3 forms of the term add-on instruction. The first one is the best one, it's recommended, and the other 2 are, non-standard, or they should be discouraged. But this doesn't mean that people in your organization aren't using the discouraged forms. We see all kinds of inconsistencies in the way people write. Much like we'd like to minimize that, it still happens, right? So these forms will still come up for translation, and therefore your translators need to know about them. And your CAT tools need to be able to match all 3 forms to the same translation. So this is why you have an interest in documenting these variant forms in your glossaries, even if, as I said, they aren't something your organization promotes. Okay. Now, in grammatical terms, the ing form of a verb is called a gerund, and these are often used in English as nouns. For instance, you can say, blogging is fun, or blogging is a waste of time. That would be my favorite, blogging is a waste of time. So in this sentence, the structure, in this particular sentence structure, blogging is the subject of the verb is, and therefore it's a noun. Almost every verb in the English language can be turned into a noun by adding this ing to its end. So I often see 2 entries in glossaries, the noun ending in ing and the verb without the ing. And of course, as you can see on the screen here, the definition should be written accordingly. A definition of a noun should be written for nouns like the act of, and a definition for the verb should be starting in infinitive verb. Okay, but having these 2 entries, or in cases like this, it's really redundant. Really, we're talking about a verb here, and just sort of manipulating it a little bit in usage so that it can be used as a noun, but it's really a verb. So I say that the infinitive verb has more matching potential in tools than the gerund noun. Most tools should be able to match an infinitive verb to this ing form. So I suggest to avoid the ing word, this gerund, and keep the infinitive verb in your glossaries. You don't want to give translators 2 or 3 of the same thing to translate, okay? You want to avoid redundancy because it's extra work to create these multilingual glossaries anyway, so let's try to just give what they need and eliminate what's redundant. Okay, so now most people would know this, okay, but it still needs to be stated in any case. Each row in your Excel sheet should include all the terms in all languages that have the same meaning. In other words, the row is a structure to contain a concept. I see this rule violated all the time, so we do need to re-emphasize it. We'll have some examples here coming up, but anyways, this first example here is just a sort of a generic example of a spreadsheet glossary. So as with any spreadsheet, the top row should contain a label for the contents of each column. Here we can see a typical example. Now I can't tell you exactly what the labels in the top row should look like. If you're just circulating your spreadsheet among colleagues, among other translators, then you can use whatever labels you want for the top row. But try to be simple and clear in any case. Nevertheless, if you are going to import your glossary into another tool, then you may have to take care on how the top row looks, the labels. You may need to research the tool that you're using to see what kind of labels it requires in order to support import of this spreadsheet into a database. So I suggest including, at a minimum, in a spreadsheet, or any glossary for that matter, the part of speech value and a context sentence for each source language term. So in this case, what you see here, the source language is English. The part of speech is recommended by international standards because it's important grammatical information that is used in various applications. Now, I've had translators say to me, well, we don't need the part of speech value. We know that. We're not stupid. We know what part of speech this word is. But even though it might seem obvious, it's not a lot of effort to add the part of speech value. And in fact, there are homographs and homonyms in English that do have different parts of speech values. So I still say put it in. It's usually not much work. And it's helpful in some cases. And if you should ever decide to import your glossary into a database, chances are you're going to need it. So do include the part of speech. Excuse me. The context sentence is a sentence that contains the term. Okay, it's not some abstract context of where the term is used or how it's used. It's an actual sentence that contains the term. This is a linguistic term. We use context to say exact sentence that contains the exact term. So usually you can find these. You just you search on your company's intranet or whatever, and you can easily find a context for most terms. And it's an easy to grab bit of information that is useful because we don't usually have time to write definitions. And even though context sentences are often not nearly as good as definitions, they're sometimes helpful and better than nothing. And you can see on my screen here that I have a French term and a Spanish term, but I didn't put a part of speech. And this is just to remind you that you do not need to repeat the part of speech for every language in the row. Not that that hurts, and if you have the time, do put it in. But I've found by experience that very, very often the part of speech of the translations is the same as the part of speech of the source language term anyways. There are very few exceptions to this. So you can more or less assume that the part of speech is going to be the same for all terms in the row. And if you do end up needing the part of speech for translations down the road, what I do is I copy and paste the column for the English part of speech into the column for translations, and then I scan through the file to see if there are any possible exceptions. It just saves a bit of time, and you don't really need it for every. I'm trying to find things that save time here. Okay, so if you have time, in addition to the context and the part of speech, you can add these additional pieces of information. A definition is always helpful, of course. The term type, and I'll have examples of this, especially if you have acronyms or abbreviations, they're useful. Any usage restrictions on how the term is used. Sometimes, for example, the term is only used in a particular department or for a particular product or product line. That's useful to include. Any additional notes that might be useful for translators, and categorical information. This is where I would actually put product restrictions. I would try to make up a list of product areas in the company and use that as a limited list of categories, or they're not really subject fields, but they could be similar to that, and you can make a list of them and then use that in the spreadsheet. Now, if you have a limited set of values for certain fields, and you should for part of speech, term type, and any categorical fields, use the data validation feature in Excel to limit the contents of these fields. If you're not familiar with the data validation feature, just Google it. It's easy to get instructions on how to use it, and it allows you to set up a pick list of values so that people don't type them in, and then you won't get typos and other problems in a column that should be very restricted. Okay. Now this is where we get into the data granularity I mentioned on one of my first slides, where the challenges are of using spreadsheets. Data granularity refers to the rule to just basically stick to the purpose of each column, and don't put stuff in columns where they don't belong. So if you have a column for definitions, then it should include definitions and nothing else. The definition is a sentence that describes the meaning of the term. If you have a column for context sentences, then again, they should include context sentences and nothing else. A note column, it's not a bucket to throw anything in that you want, okay? It should just contain notes that are not definitions, they are not context sentences, they are not in whatever else you might have. They are a general note that doesn't fit anywhere else. And if you need to categorize your terms, like by project, as I mentioned a moment ago, use a separate column for this, and probably try to use a limited value list. Do not put this type of information in a note. Why do we need to do all these things? Because we need a spreadsheet that's clean and rigorous. so that we can do searches on it. We can sort when we want to find things that belong to a certain product or find all acronyms. We can work with subsets of it. Even within Excel you can do this, but in a database you can use filters. So very important to stick to these kinds of rules. Okay, here we have an example of the violation of the rule. And by the way, all the examples in my presentation are real live examples that I got from real glossaries that people asked me to work with. Okay, so we have a context here, but it's not a context. It does not contain the word readout. A context must contain the word, the term, okay? So this is a note. So we put it in a note column, and we have to fill the context column with a proper context. Okay? And as you can see here, I put 2 sentences because I thought they were both useful. You can add more than 1 sentence in a context. It helps people understand the meaning more and the usage of the term. Okay. One problem I often encounter is when 2 terms have been put into the same cell. This is really bad practice because you almost totally destroy the matching potential in any tools that might use your glossary in the future, like the auto lookup function in Trados or something like that. So here we have 2 English terms in one cell and 2 Spanish terms in another cell. Each one is a term, Human Opportunity Index and HOI. Acronyms are terms, okay, just like anything else. So we need to add a second English column and a second Spanish column and put the terms there. So let's think about this for a second. If I find a third English term for this concept, and I'm just creating one off the top of my head here, like Human Opportunity Factor, then I have to add a third English column to the spreadsheet. And so if you have a multilingual spreadsheet with, say, 6 languages, and 6 languages is still quite a small number in today's world, and you only have 1 term per language per row, then if we disregard all the other bits of information for a second, like part of speech, you'll have a spreadsheet with 6 columns. But if each language has 1 extra term, even only on 1 row, okay, then your spreadsheet has 12 columns. If you have 3 terms for each language, even just, again, only once, then your spreadsheet now has 18 columns. When, so you can see that a spreadsheet will rapidly explode into something very wide when synonyms are properly accounted for in the spreadsheet. And this may be one of the reasons why people tend to not follow this rule and put multiple rows for different terms. But if you do that, then you're going to have a lot of problems in the future if you want to put your terminology, your glossary, into a database, which all the databases are concept-oriented. So there's really no way around this. You have to add these columns when you have synonyms. And here's another example in the English here where the 2 terms are not, it's not immediately obvious because there's a slash character, agricultural enterprise / organization, but it is 2 terms. And then the other example with the parentheses characters in the middle. You have to watch out and realize that these are 2 terms and split them accordingly. Okay. Okay. Another example here of putting all the terms having the same meaning on the same row. We have fuse cartridge in English and then 2 terms in French. And I don't think that fuse cartridge has 2 meanings. Really, I think it's the same meaning. Not an expert here, but assuming that they are the same meaning for this example, here you have to take the 2 French terms, which are on the target side, and put 2 French columns in your spreadsheet. Okay. Now, after going all through that and saying you have to add columns for synonyms, you have to be careful. Because just because you find 2 terms in a cell, it doesn't mean that they are actually synonyms. You, as the glossary creator or reviewer, you have to determine whether or not they're synonyms. Okay? If they are, then yes. If they are not synonyms, then yes, create two rows. I mean, if they are, sorry, I'm muddling here. If they are synonyms, then you have to put them in the same row, like I showed you on the previous slides. But if they have a different meaning, as in this example, then you need 2 rows. In this case, I can tell that the French terms have a different meaning because the first one is a noun, rampe de décélération, and the second one is a verb, diminuer graduellement. even though ramp down in English sounds odd as a verb or even as a noun, it is used in this organization in these two different ways. And one's a noun, one's a verb. And I don't know of any noun and verb that can refer to the same concept. As soon as, in my world, as soon as there are different parts of speech, there are different concepts. So I would put these in two different rows then, even though the English word looks exactly the same. Okay. So now that we have two English terms that they look exactly the same on two rows, ramp down, it would really help the translator to see how or why they represent different concepts. It's not going to be obvious to them at first. In this case, it's really easy. We just need to add the part of speech in order to make this very clear. But you have to be careful not to add this information to the term cell itself. You know, we need to, again, create a separate column for the part of speech and stick to that. Aside from just being annoying and unnecessary doing this, any extraneous information in the term cell will reduce the matching potential in applications like cat tools. So we need to create the second column. But I should add that it's also possible for two terms to look the same and yet have the same part of speech. For example, the cloud in the sky and the cloud which we figuratively use to call the internet. Okay, both of them are nouns. In cases like this, their different meanings should, if they're not self-evident, they should be provided to translators somehow in the spreadsheet so that they can provide an accurate translation. You can use the context sentence for this, you can add a definition, you can even add a note. Okay, probably the definition would be the best to explain the difference in meaning if you can spare a few moments to do that. Okay. Another big problem is when terms are found in other fields, but not in the term column. Here we have the term infrared screen, but it's shown in the note column in quotation marks. So no application, no cat tool, no controlled authoring system will ever be able to find this term infrared screen when it is searching your glossary. So those cat tools will never be able to produce the translations that might be included in this spreadsheet when it comes across infrared touchscreen, if it is lost in the note like this. Even when people use your spreadsheet manually, they'll not be able to find it easily. Most of them are going to scan up and down the term columns. So you really need to make sure to avoid this. Put all terms into a special term column so that they're not lost. Okay, so we can see that here we have IR touchscreen, part of speech noun, and then I've added a term type column because we have two terms on the same row and they're differentiated by their form. The infrared touchscreen is the full form, and it says in the note that the IR touchscreen is a short form. So it helps to capture that information in the term type column. So as I said in the last slide, there is such a thing as term type, okay? And this is very useful, especially if you have acronyms. Down the road, you may need to be able to isolate acronyms for a certain purpose. For instance, someone comes to you and asks for a list of all acronyms in all your glossaries. How do you do this if you don't have this encoded in a special column? Okay. Regardless of whether or not you'll eventually use a database, you should, in fact, identify the type of terms. And also, when you come across an acronym in your list of terms of a glossary, sometimes they're there with no full form at all. Now, how do you expect translators to translate an acronym without any indication of what it means or what its expanded form is? You'd be surprised how often I see this. An acronym in English does not transpose into the same acronym in other languages, you know. So we do need to tell the translators what is the full form so that they can properly translate it. In some cases, the translation doesn't allow any acronyms at all, okay? So please provide all the information that you think translators could use. Okay, so this slide and the next slide aren't requirements, but they include some neat ideas that I think are appreciated by linguists who are providing translations in the glossary. Like somebody like me, I'm given glossaries sometimes. I'm not multilingual, but I'm given a glossary and asked to prepare it for translators to use. So I'm kind of like doing the QA on the glossary. And when I check a spreadsheet, I try to keep the translator's needs in mind. What would it be difficult for them to translate? What is a new concept? Which acronyms have multiple full forms and are therefore ambiguous? Okay. Which terms have a unique meaning in the company? And if you highlight these terms, the translators who are working on the glossary to fill the translations will pay some special attention to them. And this is a great example here where I came across the term thefty, the one at the bottom there in yellow. I didn't know what this is. It's a brand new term in my mind, so I know that's not going to be an easy one for the translators. It's some kind of a picture that your phone takes of the person who stole your camera. So a very interesting term, and anything might prove difficult, particularly difficult, you should highlight. And another reason for doing this is sometimes there are terms in the glossary that you'd like to remove because you think they aren't needed by translators, but you're not sure. So you don't want to delete them just in case maybe the Japanese translator might find this important, the German translator might think it's not important, but who knows, we don't speak all languages. So we tend to keep more terminology in the glossary than necessarily needed. So in that case, if you can highlight the really important things, I think that's a great a service you can provide to the people using the glossary. And the next one is my favorite. Language is such an amazing thing. I love it when I can find groups of terms with similar properties. It's like I've unlocked a secret when I can put them all together. When you put terms with similar properties together, translators can ensure that the glue that binds them is equally reflected in the translations. And this makes the translated version of the content that is produced with the aid of this glossary as equally colorful and powerful as the source text. So here we have a list of words, that end in where, adware, bloatware, chargeware. This is kind of cool. How do we make sure that this unique property of this family of terms is reflected in Spanish and Russian and things like that? Of course, we're not the experts in those languages, but we can at least point out that this relationship exists and therefore help the target language linguists who are filling the glossary with their terms to kind of think about the same thing. Okay. Finally, include any comment in your glossary that might help translators. If a term is often found embedded in another term, like a larger compound, it's worth mentioning that. If a term has a strong relationship with another term, for example, a binary relationship, I use the example of the word static versus dynamic. Okay, it's like they're opposites, right? But very important to make sure that the translations clearly reflect the opposing meaning, okay? So mention these things if you think about it. Just jot it down in the comment column. And then translators can make sure that these properties are reflected in their language as well when they put the target language terms into the spreadsheet. So in this case, we have this word add-on instruction, which does occur on its own, but it often occurs with the word safety add-on instruction. And so it's certainly worth pointing that out. I think I would also put the word safety add-on instruction in the glossary itself as a term, but pointing that out in add-on instruction helps the translators who are filling the glossary to make sure that the two words work well together. Okay. Okay, I think we're just right on time now. So I have a list of useful references here. If you're not sure what to call a column or how to fill a column out, you can use these websites, isocat.org, tbxinfo.net. That includes a lot of information about TBX, which is a good guideline for terminology management, and then the TBX basic specification, which comes from Terminorgs. These provide samples and general, information about what you call a column and what it should contain. You can always contact me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to respond to your questions. So that's the last of my slides. And what I would like to do now is I'm going to show you an Excel spreadsheet containing some of the examples that I had, and then I'll show you how easy it is to actually import a glossary from Excel into a database. Okay, and then we'll open it up for questions. So let me go to my Excel sheet. Okay. All right. I hope you can see this. Maybe I can make it a bit larger. All right, so I'm displaying on the screen right now a spreadsheet that includes the terms that you saw in my examples. So you can see there's a lot of empty cells here. A lot of them don't have a context sentence. I didn't bother to fill in all the context sentences, and there's only one of them has a definition and so on. But it just gives you an idea how it would look. So I put the definition in the first column before the first English term. And you have to make a note of this. Whatever, in most applications that allow import of Excel sheets, most of them, if you put columns before the first English term or the first language term, that would be considered concept level, okay, concept level of the entry or of the database entries. So in this case, I decided to put the definition at the concept level. That's before the first English term. I didn't have to. I could have put the definitions somewhere else, like right after the English term. Then it would appear in the term level of the database. So I'm just pointing that out. Then you have the English term. You can see here part of speech, term type. I didn't put a term type for all of them, but I could. A context sentence, the note in one of them, and a second English term. So here we have second English column. This is for the acronym and the several English synonyms that I had in my examples. And there's some term types here for this term. You notice that I did not put a part of speech in the second English term. I could if I want to, but it's not absolutely necessary. Then I have French, 2 French terms because that happened once or twice, Spanish, Korean, and Russian. So this is what we have in all of our examples. Very simple spreadsheet. Even though it's simple, though, it's already got a lot of columns, as you can see. And we get a lot more sometimes. Okay, so I'll quickly launch the database I'm going to try. And this is TermWeb. This is the host of our webinar today is Interverbum Technology, so I'm going to use their tool. But any tool, well, not any tool, but most tools would allow import from Excel sheets, and the Excel sheet that I just showed you should work in most cases. So what I did before this call is I created an empty database that contained the fields and the languages that are in my spreadsheet. So definition, context, part of speech, that thing, and the Russian, Korean, and so on. So now there's nothing in here now, and I'm just going to do an import. So I'll go to admin and go to import, and then I create an import definition, which is very simple. It's just select your file. You can create more complex definitions that do things like merge or skip if there's doublets and stuff like that, but I'm just creating a new import, so it's straightforward. Just choose my file, and it's on my desktop. Where is it now? Let's see now. Here we go, webinar. And that's the file I was just showing you, the import Excel file. Okay, click next. And it's 11 concepts, so that's because there are 11 rows in my Excel file. Number of terms is 27, and 5 languages. If there were problems, it would have reported the problems here, and I could have gone back and fixed the Excel file, but no problem, so it's valid. Now it's going to go through the import. It's asking about a mappings from sections. I don't have any sections in my file. This system allows different sections, so this is going to be good. There's no problem with that. And it shows you what it's importing, the different fields and the different languages. Everything looks good here, so I can click next. And it's going to import these terms now. And it says everything's done. If there was a problem, for example, a lot of times I create databases where the part of speech field is mandatory, because I like that, okay? I didn't do that for this database. If it was mandatory and I had not included the part of speech for 1 or 2 of those terms, it would report which terms would have failed. They still would have been imported, but it would have given me a list of the terms which had failed, and I can go back in and add the part of speech. So let's finish this. Okay, so back to my database, search view. Now we should be able to see if everything goes well. Yeah, here we have the terms that I've imported, and you can see them all listed here, okay? And if you click on one, you'll see the information. Okay, so not a lot of information here, but there could be a lot more, but That's the way it is. Okay, so that's how an import works. You can see how easy it is if you've got a decently structured Excel spreadsheet. Now the last thing I want to show you is, you might be in here now and go, oh, I forgot to change the part of speech to 65 terms, and now I've imported it. Well, of course, you can always go back to your Excel sheet and make changes and re-import it and overwrite the existing entries or create a new database or however it is you want to handle that situation. But in this tool, you don't actually have to do that. Even though you've already imported, you can still kind of use a spreadsheet function. This is called the grid view. And you just click this button down here or this one up here. I'll try this one. And what it does is it takes all the terms that are in the current view, which happen to be my whole database, but I could have written I could have used a filter to filter out some terms. If I have a database with 10,000 terms, I'm not going to put them all in the spreadsheet. I might want to just edit maybe all the ones that were done last week or by a certain person. So you can use filters to define that. Okay, and once you get the terms in that you want, I forgot to click open. Okay, open grid view. Then you will see them looking here, like here is coming up a view that looks kind of like a spreadsheet. If it comes up, it's loading. And there you have it. So it looks exactly like a spreadsheet, and you can do the same things here that you can do in a spreadsheet. Okay, you can sort the columns to bring different things up. You can directly edit any of these fields. For example, if I want to add a note here, I can just add it. Sorry, I have to press. There you go. Press tab to save. There we go. And you can also change multiple terms at once. The same, well, that's even better than a spreadsheet, actually. For example, let's say I wanted to add the same note to these 3 entries. Okay, I could just randomly pick whatever entries I want here, and then just go down to the bottom and say, okay, I want to change. Go find the term level field, the English field is in the English level sections, and then we had a look at the note here and just put, hi, this is Kara, and then you can add those notes and they go into the spreadsheet. And then when you click save, everything goes into the database. So you can work with the spreadsheet function within the database rather than exporting and then re-importing. Okay. Yes. Okay. So now we should go back to the search view. So that's all I have to show right now, and we do have time left for some questions, and close this. And I would like to ask Mats to manage the mute. Okay.
Right. Any questions are welcome. Yeah, there's one question here from Patricia. Is there a preferred order for your columns? A preferred order for your columns?
Well, it is important to make sure that the concept level columns come before the first language term. So the first, in my example, there's the first English term. So if you have a subject field, for example, you'd like to record a subject field or a product category, those are often concept level. They apply to all terms in the entry, is what I mean. So they should, anything that applies to all terms in the row should be considered a concept level information and should go in a special column before the first English term. Between one English term and the next English term, of course, you have the columns that correspond to the first English term, so part of speech, term type, context, and so on. Other than that, I don't think it matters to much degree what order you put in. I tend to put the most important, what I feel are the most important pieces of information first, like part of speech, I think, so I put it right after the term, and the notes or whatever near the end. So I don't think it really matters, though.
There's another question from Maria Vega. Do you advise having more than one spreadsheet if you translate for different industries, different fields, different, I assume you mean different subject fields, subject areas, right?
Well, as I said in my very first, one of my very first slides, I don't recommend spreadsheets at all. So there you go. Especially if you're going to be doing a lot of terminology that becomes a little bit more complex with different categories, different clients, different product areas. It starts to get messy with spreadsheets. So at a certain point, you need to consider moving into a proper terminology management system like the one we see here on the screen, which is a very good one. But I would tend to avoid separate spreadsheets to go back to the question, if I must stick to spreadsheets, I would tend to avoid using separate ones because then you don't have a big picture of all your terminology. You can use separate sheets within the same spreadsheet file. At least that would be the most I want to separate it, because at least you can search within the entire spreadsheet file across all tabs or sheets within that file. At least you can do a search across all, whereas you can't search across different files. But I would tend to keep the terminology as much together as possible. And if you need to categorize it, that's fine. Just add a column with a special category, client A versus client B or whatever, and you can manage it quite well that way.
Any more questions? There's another one here from Katerina Toraki. In ISO standards, concept often use one, etc. How do they think we can manage in Excel? So you mean concept often use one within parentheses, etc. How do you think we could manage in Excel sheet?
Concepts often use one. Oh, I see what she means. How do we manage that in Excel sheet? Record one. Yeah, you will see in ISO standards, in each standard there's a section, usually it's section 3, that is terms and definitions, and they will put the terms from the standard in there and definitions. And if there's more than one usage of the same term, which there actually shouldn't be in a standard, but if there is, then they will use a number, just like in dictionaries, number 1 for the first meaning and number 2 for the second meaning. So that means we have 2 different meanings. So they need to be 2 different rows in the spreadsheet. If you're asking whether we should put the number 1 and the number 2, I wouldn't. But if it helps you in your process, maybe you need the numbers, then you can do that. But I don't think it's necessary. But I wouldn't put two definitions in the same. I wouldn't put 2 definitions meaning different concepts in the same definition cell.
At least not in the term cell, right? Like, because for recognition, it's disastrous to put numbers.
Don't put anything in the don't put anything in the term cell except the terms in themselves. Yeah.
And then there is another question here: is W platform, web platform, I assume, collaborative? Can other people edit the terms and the data categories? Can other people edit the term? Yeah.
If you're talking about TermWeb, which is the web platform on the screen now, yes, it is collaborative. Yes. And we can have different people editing with different access levels, and we can have workflows that automatically notify people to become involved when they need to. So it's quite good in managing terminology. Of course, we don't get those functions in a spreadsheet, so that's another advantage, I guess. Let's see, okay. Does it keep the history?
Yeah.
Yes, actually, you can see the history on the screen right now. It said that it's created 2 terms by Kara, 1938 today, and I changed it also a few minutes later. This is when I added the hi, this is Kara to the note from the grid view. And this tool, you can revert back. So if I don't like this note, I can just restore it to the state, and it will go away. It's not a very nice note anyway. So, yeah. So there is history here and the ability to restore.
But you also mean keeping versions, right? You said. So of course you can have versions. I mean that's an intrinsic function of versions.
Versions. Well, I think that's what we just had. I just got rid of the second version, but I think that's what this means. Yeah.
some people have asked me about versioning, and that you may have different parts of the database for different versions of a software. There might be a change of terminology between if you make software translations, and that's another thing. I don't know if
Yeah,
you mean, yeah. Then you can have
yeah.
different parts of the database, of course. Yeah.
Exactly. And what I mentioned earlier about that term, what was the term? I can't remember now, with the hyphen and without the hyphen, and there were three terms, remember? And I said, well, one of them is recommended. The other two, though, even though they're not recommended, you need to include them in the spreadsheet because you need to facilitate the auto lookup function in cat tools and so on. So that's very important, but what you can add to your spreadsheet is a column indicating the status of the term. This one is preferred, this one is deprecated, as we have in the TBX standard. And then you can have, it will be evident here in the database, even in the spreadsheet too, but also in the database, which one is the preferred term. And this is how you can develop terminology that can be greatly useful for controlled authoring applications, and also controlled translations, but also. So I didn't mean to say that you should just throw, poor terms into your system without thinking about it. You should, you should at least indicate if you know that one term is preferred and the others are not through this special column. Sometimes you don't know which one is preferred, in which case just you have to put them in anyways, but you don't have to mention it. But if you do know, you should put it in.
And there is also a question whether it's possible to have a free demo. Yeah, you can go to our website if you wish and check, have a 1 week or 2 week test, so you can check out the system yourself.
You can get the demo yourself online and play with it, but I'd also be happy to give anybody any personal meeting or demo. Sometimes it's not easy to just know everything without reading a lot and learning a lot, but this is quite intuitive, this software, so it shouldn't be a problem. But I'm available if anybody would like to contact me about that. We have a question. May I trust it for data confidentiality? Because I guess because it is in the cloud, right? Well, I'll let Mats. I'll let you respond to that question.
Yes, it's encrypted and everything. So, and also there is a system for hiding things that are secret, if you wish. If you have an organization developing new secret things, you can hide parts of the database for everyone but a very limited group of people, so that in that respect as well. And also the transmission of data is encrypted. So yes, there is a short answer. You are only allowed to do certain things if you're a member of a certain group. That's the thing. Mm. Access management, right? Anything more? Any more questions?
I'm coming back on webcam so I can give a personal face to the end.
Right. Okay.
I really enjoyed this myself, putting this all together. A lot of things we know already and take for granted, but it's good to be reminded about these important things. And I do feel that if you take good care of making a good Excel glossary, then you won't have to go back and make, and fix problems, and you'll save time in the long run. And I think that eventually most people will end up one day using a database. So you have to take care to create good Excel sheets right now.
Okay. Thank you for your attention then. And
okay, bye everyone.
Bye everyone. Thank you.